A 14-year-old boy was found bleeding in the street. Police arrived. 2 women begged them not to give him back. They did anyway. He was dead within an hour. This happened in 1991, in Milwaukee, with witnesses present. And it wasn't the first time warnings were ignored. What you're about to see isn't about one killer. It's about 17 preventable deaths, and the system that chose not to prevent them. Their names were Stephen Hicks, Tony Hughes, Konorak Synthesumphone. Milwaukee. Late 1980s. A city alive with rhythm, laughter, and survival. The bars along 2nd Street were more than places to drink, they were safe havens. Inside, music drowned out judgment, and people built families from the fragments of rejection. On those streets, young men walked beneath flickering lights, not looking for danger, but for belonging. This wasn't a hunting ground. It was home. In the next 20 minutes, you'll see the street where it happened. Hear the calls that were ignored. And understand why 17 deaths were preventable. This isn't speculation. This is documented. Stephen Hicks was just 19, hitchhiking home from a rock concert in June of 1978. His friends remembered him as easygoing, always laughing, the kind of person who could talk to anyone. He was heading into the Ohio summer, thinking about college, about music, about everything that still lay ahead. Tony Hughes was 31. Deaf since childhood, but never silent. He expressed himself through art, vivid sketches and portraits that spoke of resilience and hope. His friends said Tony had a gift for connection, his world was quieter, but never empty. And then there was Konorak Synthesumphone. 14 years old. His family had fled Laos after the Vietnam War, building a new life in Milwaukee. He was a playful kid, curious about the world, trying to fit in, like any teenager would. His parents saw America as safety, a promise that they could start again. 17 faces. 17 families who tried to sound the alarm. You're going to meet 3 of them first. The ones whose stories reveal how the system failed. Each of them had a story, a rhythm, a dream, ordinary lives that shouldn't have ended the way they did. When their families speak, you don't hear tragedy, you hear memory. A favorite meal, a shared joke, a final phone call that now carries unbearable weight. But behind these stories of life, there was something else taking shape, something quieter. A pattern hidden in plain sight, inside a city distracted by fear, stigma, and indifference. The 1980s were years of division and denial. The AIDS crisis spread panic through the LGBTQ+ community. Many were cast aside by families and ignored by institutions. For young men of color, for immigrants, for anyone on the margins, trust was a fragile thing. The systems meant to protect them often turned away. And so, the danger wasn't only in one man's actions, it lived in the silence that allowed him to move unnoticed. This is not a story about how lives were taken. It's about how they were ignored until it was too late. It began slowly, warnings that went unheeded, reports that faded into files. Between 1982 and 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer had multiple run-ins with the law, arrests for public indecency, disorderly conduct, exposure. The signs were there, a pattern of behavior escalating in small but alarming ways. In 1988, He was convicted of second-degree sexual assault for molesting a 13-year-old boy. The court ordered counseling, probation, and a brief prison term. He told officials he was remorseful. They believed him. He attended some sessions, but there was no system to monitor his progress or measure risk. Once again, he slipped back into the world with minimal oversight. The system treated the symptom, not the disease. And then came the night of May 27, 1991. Two women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, saw a young boy stumbling through the street. He was injured, incoherent, terrified. They called the police immediately. When officers arrived, they found a dazed child, bleeding, wrapped in a blanket. That boy was Konorak Sinthasumphone, 14 years old. Dahmer appeared, calm and confident, telling police the boy was his adult partner, that they'd had a misunderstanding. The officers, seeing two black women insisting something was wrong and a white man insisting all was fine, made their choice. They returned the boy to his killer. Inside the building, Glenda Cleveland, Sandra's aunt and Dahmer's neighbor, watched with disbelief. She had called the police before. She would call again. But each time, she was dismissed. "I tried to tell them something was wrong," she said years later. That night, Konorak was murdered within minutes of being brought back. The officers, later disciplined but reinstated, had even joked about the incident on their radios. Institutional blindness had a cost. Families across Milwaukee had already been filing missing person reports for months. But their sons were labeled runaways, transient, or likely moved away. Many were black or brown, some were immigrants, some were gay. Few were believed. There was no coordinated effort to connect these disappearances. No database. No urgency. Whose lives counted enough to investigate? Whose disappearances mattered? Glenda Cleveland's persistence became a moral anchor in this story, a woman who saw what others refused to see. She wasn't trained in law enforcement, but she knew something was terribly wrong. She kept calling. No one listened. By the time investigators began to realize the scope of what was happening, years of evidence had been overlooked. One detective would later admit, "We had all the pieces. We just couldn't see the picture." July 22, 1991. Inside apartment 213, something shifted. A man named Tracy Edwards had accepted an invitation from Dahmer, just as so many others had before him. But Edwards noticed the odd smell, the strange behavior, the tension in the air. He saw the handcuffs, the knife. He realized he was in danger. He spoke calmly, looked for an opening, waited for his moment, and when it came, he ran. He flagged down police officers and led them back to the apartment. When they entered, what they found defied comprehension. Photographs. Identifications. Evidence documenting years of violence. But the horror wasn't in the objects, it was in what they revealed. 17 lives. 17 sons, brothers, friends. The officers who entered that night were changed forever. What they discovered forced Milwaukee, and the nation, to confront the unimaginable. But this isn't about the shock of discovery. It's about what the discovery exposed. For years, people had tried to sound the alarm, neighbors, families, community advocates. Each time, they were ignored. Now, the silence was over. Community meetings filled with anger and grief. Families learned that their loved ones, the ones they'd been searching for, were gone. The LGBTQ+ community mourned openly, demanding accountability. Shirley Hughes learned that her son Tony was among the victims. The Synthesumphone family endured unbearable pain, first one son assaulted in 1988, and now, another murdered after police handed him back. Dahmer confessed quickly, almost eagerly, describing his crimes in excruciating detail. But confession is not redemption. His words did not ease the grief or answer the question that mattered most. How did we let this happen? In court, the question wasn't just what Dahmer did, it was why. His lawyers argued insanity. The prosecution argued awareness and control. Experts filled the courtroom, debating pathology and accountability. Could someone plan, manipulate, and conceal such acts, and still be legally insane? The jury decided he could not. He was found sane, and guilty, on all counts. But outside the courtroom, another question echoed. If he was responsible for his actions, who was responsible for the systems that failed to stop him? Families sat through testimony no one should have to hear. When Rita Isbell, sister of victim Errol Lindsay, stood up in court, her grief tore through the silence. "I will never have another happy day for the rest of my life," she said, her voice shaking with pain and rage. In that moment, she gave voice to every family whose warnings went unanswered. The verdict brought sentences, 15 consecutive life terms, but not peace. Accountability had arrived in one form, but the deeper failures remained unaddressed. Police reforms were promised. Mental health evaluations were reviewed. But the same biases that had blinded the system were still deeply rooted. This trial was not only the story of one man's guilt, it was the mirror held up to an entire structure of neglect. Families left the courthouse carrying grief that would never fade. Some found a measure of closure, others found only emptiness. There was no justice equal to what was lost. November 28, 1994. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed in prison by another inmate, Christopher Scarver. It happened during morning work detail, quickly, brutally. There were no grand conclusions, just the end of a man whose crimes had already changed the course of countless lives. But the story didn't end there. After the trial, Milwaukee faced itself. Police departments reviewed policies on missing persons and bias. Training improved, at least on paper. The LGBTQ+ community began to organize more visibly, building stronger networks for safety and support. And yet, much remained unchanged. Funding for mental health services was still limited. Biases in policing still shaped outcomes. And in other cities, similar failures would repeat. Still, communities rebuilt. Families established scholarships in victims' names. Neighborhoods held memorials. Glenda Cleveland continued to advocate for justice and awareness until her death in 2011. Her courage, her persistence, became part of Milwaukee's conscience. And each year, the Pride Parade marched again through those same streets, the same city that once turned away, now choosing visibility over silence. There are questions that still linger. How do we balance compassion for mental illness with accountability for harm? How do we build systems that truly see the vulnerable? And when do explanations become excuses? For the families, there was never closure, only continuation. Tony Hughes' mother once said, "I talk to him every day. I tell him about his nieces and nephews. He should have met them." That's what remains. Love that persists in the face of everything that tried to erase it. Dahmer's crimes were not inevitable. Every missed report, every dismissed call, every assumption was a choice point. This isn't a story about evil, it's a story about how institutions, when guided by bias and neglect, can allow unimaginable harm to unfold. 17 people should still be alive. The women who called for help should have been heard. The families who begged for answers should have been believed. The neighbors who saw danger should have been taken seriously. This isn't about a monster. Monsters aren't real, people are. And people can fail, or they can choose to do better. The story ends not in death, but in the spaces left behind. In the families that keep remembering. In the communities that keep fighting. And in the belief that vigilance is love in action. Because justice isn't a verdict. It's the ongoing work of listening, of believing, of never looking away again. 17 lives. Each one a warning the system failed to hear. If stories like this matter to you, stories that seek truth, not thrill, then stay with us. Because on Serial Killer Profile, we don't just revisit the crimes. We uncover the patterns that allowed them to happen. Subscribe, and never miss the next case that exposes the darkness we're still living with.